we're doing a lot of stuff with, so we'll continue, and we're really glad they're in our region, so we're thankful that he's come to speak to us today. He attended UNC Chapel Hill in undergraduate and medical school. So he finished as a physician there and did his residency at Michigan State University. He retired in 2022, so not too long retired, so I'm glad his schedule's open to do things like this, from being a physician in Burke County, so long-term physician there. He's also done a lot of historical work. He's been on the historic Burke County Foundation as a docent, actually, for the Exploring Drawer Foundation. So he's done some work in history, done some work, with the archaeological site there, educational outreach, so that's great. And today he hopes to kind of give us a sense of the importance of the Scots-Irish, neat group of people that had an effect on our nation's founding and our guiding principle today. So John, you ready to start? We'll go from there. And I'll drop some lights to help us with
that'd be great.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Gary, for inviting me, and thank you for the lovely dinner. And I send you greetings from down the mountain in Morganton, in Burke County, and Kevin Hancock, and congratulations on your Patriot Award. And they mentioned also Robert Patton. Every club, if you're really successful, has a pit bull, and Robert Patton's a pit bull. If Robert Patton comes and asks you to do something, he sinks your teeth into the sensitive parts of your flesh, and he'll let go when you say yes. And that's the way I got involved in all this. That's the deal. I have just a couple of notes to look from, and we'll get right into this. This is an audience participation. I wondered if one light could come up. It's either all or none?
I think so.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it like this, and I think we'll be just fine. This is audience participation. If you're going to sit there like a frozen Presbyterian in church, you're not going to get very far, and I'll just leave. There's money involved. I've got big money over here for those that can answer the questions right. And we've just gotten through St. Patrick's Day. And I want to have a show of hands. Who in this group thinks they've got a little Irish blood in them? Oh, about 2/3. Okay. Now, I may have you raise your hand again, but this specifically is, who thinks they've got some Scot in them? All right. Who thinks they've got some English blood? And who thinks that they are Scots-Irish? And who is very certain that you know exactly what that means? And who may have raised their hand, and this takes guts, but that's all right, we're a gutsy group, we're patriots. Who in this group raised their hand, but they have to say, I'm not completely sure that I know what a Scots-Irish person is from a historically accurate point of view? Everybody does. Well, if you didn't, this is the place to come. You come to lectures to learn stuff. So there we go.
If I had to butt in here and act like Ms. Geddes when they tried to use the Episcopal privilege, it seems to me I know a lot of usages of Scots-Irish.
Yes.
And I know a lot of history, and I go with the historical meaning just like with Anglo-Irish.
Right.
Usages here tend to blend over into more localized American things.
That's exactly what we're going to be talking about. So who were these people, and where did they come from? How did they get tangled up in the American Revolution? How did they wind up down in a place called Kings Mountain? How did they turn the war? How have they, blended and had a major role in the formation of our American form of government? Now, I've got a couple of things I want to say. Is anyone in here just a card-carrying Presbyterian? I got a couple. All right, is anybody here a card-carrying Roman Catholic? Okay. So the first thing I want to say is that I'm going to say a few things that are nasty about the Presbyterians, but mostly pretty good. I'm going to say some nasty things about the Roman Catholics, and I don't want you to be offended. We're talking about the way people thought about the Catholic Church 250 years ago. I have a lovely son-in-law that is Roman Catholic, and I go to their Mass from time to time, so You know, don't throw tomatoes at me, please, okay? This is a history lesson. And, the other thing I want to talk about is history in general. And I am a physician by training, and I've learned something as my father sat me on his knee, who was also a physician, said, that John, medicine's a very imprecise science. It's not like physics. There's more than one way of doing things. You sometimes get things wrong. And as I got into history, I said, my goodness, history's the same thing. It's subjective. Almost everything I say today could probably be questioned by somebody saying, that's not accurate. You're not right about that. It's subjective. As you've heard the phrase, the history's written by the winners. Everybody heard that phrase? Well, history's also written by fallible, sinful people, and they're going to put their spin on things, and that's probably what I'm gonna do today. There's a lot of myth and folklore. You know, did Washington throw a dollar across the Delaware? Did the cherry tree story? Well, there's some questions about whether that really happened. The facts of a battle are rarely all known, and people forget stuff. And what is emphasized is subjective, and so facts are left out. I have watched history presentations from northern historians that just leave this whole thing out down here, you know. And I said, how could you leave that out? That's what changed the war. And they say, no, it's Saratoga's what changed the war, sir. So you can get into these debates about things like this. So the honest historian, and I'd like to think I'm at least honest, I'm gonna try to get this right, but at best it's an approximation. We're gonna start at the end of the book, and then we're gonna go back to the beginning, and we're gonna wind up at the end of the book again. There's a brief summary. This is stuff I'm preaching to the choir. I would think most SAR and DAR people sort of know this story. The war broke out in 1776 after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and there were a bunch of battles in the north. This is an extremely concise summary, and it had become a stalemate. The British could not subdue General Washington and his insurgent forces, but neither could the insurgents drive the British off of American soil. England was becoming frustrated over the war effort. This was the person on the street. They were starting to wonder, should we be sending people over there to die? This is costing us a lot of money. And Lord North, who happened to be Prime Minister at the time, offered to resign to King George. Well, King George said, no, you're not resigning. I want you to come up with a new strategy for ending the war. And we've heard about the Southern strategy. We're going to go into great detail about that, more detail. And as you know, British General Clinton sailed south with about 5,000 people, and they captured Charleston and Savannah, and he went back up north, and he left a person in command called George Cornwallis, a man whom he thoroughly despised. And the American forces then were routed at Camden, and so it looked as though this Southern strategy was working. As you probably know, the thought behind the Southern strategy was, there are a lot of Tories or British loyalists down here, and we can recruit them and amass an army and defeat these rebels and move north and trap Washington, and the war of the insurgency will be over. Certainly the Camden defeat gave the British forces a lot of hope. Cornwallis moved north into that little shanty town called Charlottetown, 20, 30 houses and a courthouse and a tavern. There was a very young and very aggressive leader called Bannister Tarleton. They guarded his rear flank. He didn't need a lot of guarding on the eastern side because they were mostly loyalists, and he recruited and had a guy named Patrick Ferguson placed in charge of his western flank. And there were pockets of resistance in the south, and they are now names of towns and counties around here, named Pickens and Francis Marion, the Swamp Rock. And the British, for the most part, seemed to be winning. There was a battle at Musgrove's Mills. there was a prisoner of war. He sent that prisoner of war up into the mountains, mainly north and west of here, with a message. And this is Major Patrick Ferguson. Major Patrick Ferguson was really quite a guy. He was an older man. He was considered the best shot in the British Army. He invented, and you guys that know guns, and I don't, I've had to learn them, he invented the breech loading rifle, which means that you load, for those that are totally uninitiated, you load the musket ball down here instead of down the barrel. It was never actually used much in the war, but he was really, really a smart guy. Well, history records that Ferguson issued a decree, and that decree was, you people up here desist from your opposition to the British arms. You take protection under your standard, or he, meaning I, will march my army over the mountains and hang your leaders and lay your country to waste with fire and sword. Well, they knew they had an army, and if you were living up in the mountains of Burke County, and this used to be Burke County, I want you to know that, and up into what is now present-day Tennessee, what would you do? What were your options? Well, you could be afraid and run away. That's an option. You could amass the militia and wait for them to show up, or you could amass together and fight them as a group when they came up. Or the fourth option would be you would amass the militias and come and try to meet them on the way. And that's in fact what was done. This is the famous loose portrait of Greenlee Ford. If you come down to Morganton, we can show you the exact place in the historical marker where it is, where over 1,400 men gathered from all over what is now Western Tennessee and, Eastern Tennessee and Southern Virginia, and of course, North Carolina. And they moved south and eventually, of course, met Major Patrick Ferguson on the mountain, Kings Mountain. But if you're going to understand history, you've got to look at, what were these people thinking? Why such a ferocious response? They could have just hidden. They were good at doing that. What caused this? Why such animosity towards the British? When did this start that week, or was it much, much older? And when you get done, you're gonna know the answer to that. It was much, much older. And why did this all play out the way it did? Well, we know that in that group of 1,400, there were French Huguenots, there were Germans, there were probably some Swedish people, there were even African American slaves in that group. But by far and away, the most common ethnic group in that group were the Scots-Irish. Well, usually in history you have to start at the beginning, don't you? And we are going to take a gigantic 20-minute sweep of history to tell everybody here how we got to this point. And there are 3 events in history. Suppose you are a person that was born in Europe in 1450 and died in 1520. You would say that's reasonable, right? Tom? And 3 events occurred within your lifetime, if you lived during that time, that totally, utterly, and forever changed Western history. We think we live in tumultuous times today, and we do, but this was really, really tumultuous. And there are no other 3 things in world history that would have such an effect over the next 500 years. We are still feeling the effects of these 3 things. And here's where the money comes in, because you're going to tell me what those 3 things are, and I'm even giving you a hint. One is an invention, one is a discovery, and one is a revolt against an entrenched power. The invention.
Printing press.
You got it! Gutenberg's printing press, there it is. The printing press changed everything about civilization, everything. Because all of a sudden, you did not have to rely on monks and monasteries to write things out. You could make multiple copies, and people started to see this, so what did they start to learn to do? They started to learn how to read, and for the first time we had a rising of the literacy rate. And the first thing people read and wanted to read was what? The Bible. And they started to say, you know, the priest is telling us stuff that we don't see there in the Bible. And they started to question a lot of other things about science and everything else. Okay. Now, the second thing was a discovery. And it was a discovery that would change everything forever.
In 1492.
14, golly, Moses. There is absolutely no question, and when we talk about Chihuahua, which is the first Spanish settlement in the interior of what's now the United States, we highlight that this was a big deal. Now, were there Europeans that showed up somewhere on the North American continent before then? Of course, there were Vikings, but they did not have the means of going back to say, hey, there's this whole other continent over here. And so that was a big deal. And so you've got the discovery of America, you've got the printing press, and the third thing is a revolt against an entrenched power.
1485, Tudors succeed.
Reformation.
Plantagenets.
Who's that?
Reformation.
That's what I'm getting. Congratulations. The Protestant Reformation. Now, did Luther wake up one morning in 1517, October 31st, and say, geez, I've got a problem with the Catholic Church. I'm going to take these 95 points and nail them on the walls of Wittenberg? Well, that indeed happened, but this was a culmination of a lot of things. The reason Luther gets all the credit, you Lutherans are very proud of that, I'm sure, is that it just exploded at that point. Believe me, there's a group of people down in Valdez called Waldensians, and they were protesting lots of things in the Catholic Church as early as 1186, and a lot of other groups were too. But we'll give Luther his credit, and that happened in 1517, but it had been building up. These are three very, very tumultuous things. Now, going on at this time in the world, we had the rise of the great nation states, right? And they predictably fought against each other. 5 nation states in Spain, all vying for control and hegemony over their areas and others. Spain, France, Portugal, Netherlands, and England. Spain was absolutely first out of the gate. They had the money to finance Columbus's expedition to North America. They were looking for trade routes. They were looking for spices. People like spices, and that was from the East Indies. If you remember, 1492 was probably the discovery of America was probably the least important thing that happened in Spain during that year. They united the country. There were 2 big provinces called Castile and Aragon. You had Ferdinand and Isabella, and they united their language. The language, Isabella went out, the women always went out. So the language of Madrid, which was called Castellano, became the official language of Spain. We can know it now as Spanish. Right. What you're speaking when you speak Spanish, I speak a little, is what they spoke. And they had a daughter, and she's going to come into play in just a little while. France was big, Portugal was big in the Netherlands. So, they came to America, the Spanish. They established forts at St. Helena and St. Augustine. And yes, they had an entrada into the interior of North America. They were looking for a route for their silver mines in Zacatecas, Mexico. And Juan Pardo said, we're going to camp in this place with the Indians, this big tribe of Indians in a place called Chihuahua. And when the spring comes, we'll go over the mountains, and Mexico's about right here, isn't it? You know, and that's where we'll get the silver mines and take them back, so we won't have to worry about these pesky French that have ships all over the Gulf of Mexico ready to wipe us out. And so that's why Burke County's famous, and I've been out there digging, and it is a thrill to uncover something that is 500 years old and put it in your hand. Well, all right, history's always changing, so we talked about these powers. In about 1500s, there was a new power emerging. It challenged Spain and France, and it was vested essentially in one man and one king, and such a consequential personality rarely hits the world stage but once every few hundred years. Can anybody tell me who that is? We have a cheap chapter down in Morgan, and so I've run out of money. Hancock and Patton have got me locked in, but you're gonna have to tell me who this person is.
Henry VIII.
Henry VIII, y'all are so smart. I knew this was a high IQ county. All right. Yes, good old Henry VIII, the greatest male chauvinist pig in all of the world.
Yes.
But he was a consequential, and remember, he was given a certificate by the Pope. He was a defender of the faith. He was a card-carrying Roman Catholic until it became inconvenient for him. And what was inconvenient, if you remember, and you remember Isabel and Ferdinand, they had a daughter. The daughter was named Catherine. Well, the way the kings consolidated their power is they married off their royalty together. So Catherine of Aragon was the first wife of this nice man. There was a problem with Catherine, is she was infertile, and we know it wasn't him. So it had to have been her, and he said, I gotta have a male heir, you know, and so he asked the Pope for a divorce or an annulment. The Pope wouldn't give it to him. And so he basically said, to H with you, I'm now the king, the head of the church, and that's how they got into that. The other thing he had to do was he had to ensure that his power was consolidated. And he then, once he threw himself into the Protestant Reformation, not for religious reasons, but for political reasons, he had to make sure that these Catholic countries around him, one of them being Ireland, one of them being France, and he said, I can take the Irish, and he went over and very quickly conquered them and established a little bit of a occupation there. He did take the lands of the Irish earls, and then he gave them back in exchange for loyalty. He established on a small scale plantations, but he was way too busy with all of his divorces and beheading of his wives and all the stuff he was doing to be too preoccupied with America. And eventually King Henry ran into a problem that most of us have experienced at one time or another. They get old and they get sick and they die, and that's what happened to Henry. And he had one child by his third wife, Jane Seymour, Edward VI, and Edward was a pathetic, poor, sickly person that didn't last very long. And once he died, there was a series of people that tried to take over the throne, but eventually a new leader, even stronger than Henry, would emerge. Anybody want to give a...
Elizabeth.
Yes, and I was going to give you the ultimate hint. It wasn't even a man. It was her. Yes, and boy, was she ever a powerhouse. And she said, we've got to get in on this game. The Spanish are over there. We've got to establish a colony. And what state did she establish that colony in? North Carolina, Roanoke. Okay? She also worried a lot about Ireland, and she increased the size of the army and navy. You know, she defeated the Spanish Armada. She ushered in a period of tremendous cultural stability and advance. There was a playwright in England that did pretty well during that time. His name was Shakespeare. Yes. So you see, you Scotch-Irish people are swept up into the great sweep of Western history. And she, of course, was a ferocious Protestant, and she established Protestant grip on the country, and she continued to repress Ireland. Well, she died in 1603, and this guy came to the front. He was not British, he was a Scots. He was James I of England, James VI of Scotland, and he also was a ferocious Protestant. In today's world, what is he most known for? The King James Version of the Bible, probably still among the most widely read. Yes, he commissioned that in 1611. And he was an anti-papist. He promoted what was still the most, famous edition of the Bible, certainly. He was afraid about encroachment by Spain and France and Ireland. And so he ran off the earls, mainly the O'Neills. Any O'Neills here? No? Okay. We have O'Neills down in Morganton, and they smile and say, yep, they ran us off from Northern Ireland. They're not all gone because some of the O'Neills are still there. But that led, the O'Neills were in the northern part of Ireland, and that led to a void in leadership. And he scratched his chin and said, the problem with Catholic Ireland is that it's full of Catholics. And what we're going to do is we're going to send our people over into that area that the O'Neills have abandoned, and we're going to establish a colony. And that was known as Ulster Plantation. And the effects of that are being felt all the way within our lifetime. And I see how old some of you are. You do remember the Troubles. You remember the IRA, all the bombings. That is still going on today as a result of good old King James. Okay, so what group did he take over? Well, his own people that were ferociously loyal to him, the Lowland Scots. Now, the Lowland Scots and the Highland Scots are two different kinds of folks. But the Lowland Scots were very poor, they were very Protestant, they were very desperate for land, and they were very loyal. And this became the Ulster Plantation. They also knew like to fight like hell, and they could take care of any conflicts with the Catholics. So here's Northern Ireland, and these places are still here today. This place in the west is a town that you know very well, Belfast, and it is County Down, County Antrim. And most of the ancestors that wound up showing up over here are kind of in this area, some from County Tyrone. This is where my son-in-law is from, and I've been there. And my folks came from the southern part of Belfast in Down County, and we have people that came from the northern part in Antrim County. So these 6 counties formed Ulster Plantation. Well, so they moved them over there around 1611, and how did these Scots-Irish do? What do you think? Not so well or pretty well?
I'd say it's kind of mixed, but,
Well,
a lot of people were quite ready to go somewhere else.
At first they did very well because they were expert sheep and cattle farmers, and they were expert weavers. The McDowells, the original McDowell that came, your county, one county over, Joseph McDowell was a weaver, okay? And they were very good at this. And they successfully battled the Irish Catholics. They were, of course, the Catholics were upset with their land had been taken away. Who wouldn't be? But the British had 2 problems as a result of this. They created a problem for themselves, 2 of them. Well, the problem number 1 was they were too successful at business. They were better at this than the English were. And the English merchants and the English weavers and the English sheep herders came to Parliament and said, you've got to do something about this. And so, in effect, they restricted their trade. There was another problem, and they took their religion very seriously, these Lowland Scots, and it was not the Church of England, which bothered them a lot. So what was happening along with Queen Anne, King William? What do we know King William for in this country? William and Mary University, exactly. They established the second university in America. Queen Anne's lace and all that good stuff, beautiful flower, but she wasn't very nice to the Scots-Irish because she instituted, it's called a test act. And here's the test question: are you loyal to the Anglican Church? And let's say
You had communion in the Episcopal Church.
you're Episcopal, well, let's suppose you're Scots-Irish and you say
You
you're
have,
not.
you had communion in the established Church of Ireland,
Yeah,
or the established
right.
Church of England,
Right.
not a Presbyterian.
Well, the problem is that if you weren't in that group, then you couldn't go to the university and you couldn't hold any offices. King William put trade embargoes in. You couldn't export cattle or sheep to England from Ulster, and wool could only be sent to England, and they just, turned around and sold it to Europe for a profit. It got so bad that if you married and you weren't married by an Anglican priest, your marriage was considered illegitimate. And then when the leases ran out, the Scots-Irish were ready to renew the lease, they just upped the price. Let me mention that the term Scots-Irish is indeed what we use for this group of people from lowland Scots. If you went over to Britain and said, let's talk about the Scots-Irish, they might say, who? But you say, well, let's talk about the Ulster Scots. Oh yeah, now I know who you're talking about. So that's probably more of an American term, and it was, in some cases, not all, it became more widely used after the 1850s because they wanted to distinguish themselves from the later group of immigrants that came over in the 1840s that were mainly from Southern Ireland and were mainly Catholic, and they came over because of the famine. Okay, so let's talk about Presbyterianism. And you can throw tomatoes at me if you don't agree with my theology, or the theology. This guy brought a different form of government for Protestant Revolution or Reformation to Scotland. His name was John Knox. His teacher was this guy, John Calvin. Basically what they did, and I know that you want to talk a lot about predestination and things of this nature, that actually occupies a very small part of Calvin's theology. He was more interested in the separation of power and the fact that government in the church should be shared between pastors and elders are the leaders in the church. And the congregation, not a bishop, was to choose the pastor. There was oversight by a governing body, and then a further governing body over the presbytery called a synod. So there was a system of checks and balances. Who's heard of that term? Of course you have. So keep that in mind, okay? This is Presbyterian form of government that the Scots-Irish believed in very fervently. Calvinism emphasized the sinfulness of man. All Christian religious groups emphasize the sinfulness of man. Calvin, it was on steroids. He thought man was so sinful that he had to be kept in check, especially if he was given power. It wasn't that they were against government, but they were suspicious of people that had power in government. And also because now we're not going to be listening to a pope tell us what to believe, we're going to take our word from the scripture and try to interpret it. We have to have an educated ministry. So, let's suppose you're a Scots-Irish person living, or an Ulster Scot living in the 1700s, and this is now what you're experiencing. England doesn't like you. They've put test acts on. They've got embargoes. You can't sell your stuff. You're getting rack rented out of your land. You certainly have a lot of religious prohibitions. And on about 1740, there's a famine, and then the cattle get struck with a veterinary disease. You've got a history of moving, because you moved from Scotland, did you not? Would you stay or would you leave? What would you do? Leave. You would leave, and they did. Ireland lost 40% of the population between 1700 and 1850. And just between 1710 and 1770, 1/3 of the Protestants left all service. This is 250,000 people. Well, they might have gone to other places, but most of them came to America. And they first came to New England, and ran into the Puritans. Well, Scots-Irish folks were pretty religious, but they also liked to have a good time. They danced, they drank a lot, right? And the Puritans really didn't like that. And Cotton Mather, a good old Puritan, said, these Scots-Irish, they're the most God-provoking Democrats this side of hell, and we don't want these foreigners here in New England. So, what are they used to doing? Moving. They moved. Where did they go? To relatively friendly Pennsylvania. Why? Well, William Penn was a Quaker, and he was very tolerant of them. He also was, as all Quakers were, was a pacifist, but he was a practical guy. There were things on his western frontier these people called Indians, and they were very hostile, and he needed some support, even though he himself wasn't going to carry a gun. And he knew these folks were really good at fighting, and so he offered them land. And he could profit from this as well. So this was sort of a good deal. So he took the Ulster Scots in Pennsylvania. And by that time, about 1754, the French and Indian War broke out. And who do you think formed the bulk of the British troops to fight that war? The Scots-Irish. They formed the backbone, and then Penn raised their rent, and they were used to move, so once again, they moved. Now, those of you who raised your hand and live here, I'll guarantee you, your relatives at one point lived in Pennsylvania, and you moved down here to get away from all this, and you went down the Great Wagon Road. From Pennsylvania, points west, down through Virginia. They've drawn West Virginia, it didn't exist then, and in through Roanoke, and into, not the coast, but the Piedmont, and the western part of North Carolina. Some of them even sort of drifted this way, okay? Now, something very significant was happening about 1750, 1760. When a British citizen moved over here, he would say, who are you? He'd say, well, I'm a member of the colony of Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and I am a loyal British subject. The Swedish people would say, well, I'm a Swede who's moved here. The Germans, the same thing. What about the Scots-Irish? They weren't Scot. They moved. They certainly didn't feel Irish. They certainly didn't feel British. And they didn't feel locked into any particular colony. The Scotch-Irish may have been the first people to say, I am an American. So, the Ulster Scots in America were loyal to clan over wider government. They believed in government, but they were suspicious of authority. They weren't afraid to borrow ideas from others. The log cabin absolutely was a Swedish invention, but they're the ones that really took it into the West. They were willing to fight. They knew how to fight Indian style, which is jumping from behind roots and trees. They learned from the French-Indian War as well as their conflict in Ireland, and they believed in freedom of religion. They had been discriminated against so much that they believed in this, but they needed a college. They needed a college for ministers, and colleges originally were set up in America for that purpose. You think about medical schools and law schools, that came in much, much later. And the academy, and you couldn't afford to send a young man just to study Greek and Latin very much. But they did need ministers, and they believed they needed to be literate and conversant with the Word of God and the Bible. So they set up a college. This college was in a little place in New Jersey called the Log College. It changed its name to Princeton. And here was the first president of Princeton University. His name was John Witherspoon. Anybody know what his significance is? You're real historians.
He was a Scot, now I told you, so I know about Witherspoon.
Yes, he was.
He was a Scot.
Yes.
He was, brought over to the Log College.
Yes,
He was the only minister who signed the Declaration.
that's what I'm
of
after.
Independence.
He's the only minister to sign the
Only,
Declaration.
the only practicing minister.
Yes,
There
right.
was a guy from Georgia who had been ordained, but was teaching, was
Who was
doing
that,
medicine.
Button, wasn't it?
No, I
The
didn't
other
even
guy,
come to
okay.
that. He was from Georgia.
He was from
He
Georgia.
went to medicine.
Okay.
They wouldn't have him as a preacher.
And
so
I
he
can
went
give
to
you a
medicine.
whole other lecture on, yeah, I can give you a whole other lecture on medicine. There were no medical colleges, and the couple that existed were terrible. And you basically became a doctor by studying under another doctor. And that's what you did in law as well. You were an apprentice. But this was a formal education, so Witherspoon. I want you to try to tell me who Witherspoon's most famous pupil was. And you're really gonna be good if you know this. No, Alexander Hamilton went to
Hamilton?
King's College in New York, which
Burr.
became
Burr.
Columbia.
Burr.
No, well, Burr did study under him, but there's somebody even more famous than him.
Somebody else.
Madison, yes! What is Madison known as? The father of the Constitution. I can't say that Madison was a card-carrying Scots-Irish Presbyterian, he was more Anglican,
Yep.
but he sat on the knee, almost literally on the knee of John Witherspoon, and he learned about this government of this church, this Scots-Irish church. And he's the father of the Constitution. So, what concepts did he learn? Order, government, not top-down rule, no king, no pope, checks and balances, shared power, a system of courts, Presbytery Synod, a system of courts, appeals courts, Supreme Court. Is it merely a coincidence that the government of the United States is in some ways patterned after the government of the Presbyterian Church? You tell me if it's just a coincidence. Madison never once said, oh, I got all my ideas from the Presbyterian Church. But it's just obvious that this is in the background, and I don't think it can be denied. So, huffing and puffing, trouble had been brewing. As you know, in two sentences, the French and Indian War was won by the British. The French were largely dispatched. It cost them a lot of money. The British said, you know what, y'all benefited from this, and we're out of money in the treasury, we're gonna tax you. But we don't have any representation in Parliament. I said, too bad, you're not the same as us, but we're still gonna tax you. That is probably the root of the trouble.
Mhm.
Okay, and there was lots of trouble, and it started to brew, not to mention the fact, we've got a printing press, people were reading, and, you know, people were starting to feel themselves as the Scotch-Irish. I'm not British, I'm American. So, these ideas make a difference, folks. Well, the war broke out, and as you probably know, most of the bulk of the battles were in the north. Washington did say that if he was defeated everywhere else, I'll make my stand with the Scots-Irish. The Scots formed a bulk of a big part of the troops in the north. The English parliamentarian Walpole said, there's just no use in crying about that, King George. Cousin America's run off with the Presbyterians. And that's the end of it. There's a Hessian soldier that wrote, says, you can call this war what you will, but this is a Scots-Irish Presbyterian war. And King George also referred to this insurgency as the Presbyterian War. But in the South, these Scots-Irish, they were probably intellectually in favor of the revolution, in favor of the Patriots, because they hated the British so much, but they had some other things going on. Their constant fear was much closer. They were worried about the Indians. Remember, they were all along the mountains here, and there was a little bit of suspicion of that landed gentry, those really rich people down east. You know, I don't know that I want to be part of that. And we don't have an army, we have militias. And so most of them, and they had families, so most of them stayed home. They had rifles, they worked pretty well, and they knew how to use them. Well, let's circle back to 1780, where we left off. Lord North was ready to resign. He said, you know, King George, the best we can make of this war is to just get out of it. And King George said, heck no, I'm not giving up the colonies, it's my richest possession. And he, with Lord Germain, began the Southern strategy, which we have talked about. Cornwallis takes, along with Clinton, takes Savannah and Charleston. General Gates is routed at Camden. Cornwallis moves into North Carolina, into Charlottetown, and the British seem to be winning. The threat is issued to the Patriots that I read to you. Lay down your arms and we'll come up there and burn you out and hang your leaders. So militia from present-day Tennessee, and I'm naming the leaders: Sevier, Shelby, Virginia with Campbell, Burke County with Charles and Joseph McDowell, and Wilkes with Cleveland, and Surrey with Winston. These are all now names populating our great state. And they converged at the base of the Appalachian Range at Quaker Meadows, which is the name of the plantation of the McDowells, on September 30th, 1780. There were 1,400 men. Anybody done a church picnic had to supply the food? Come on, raise your hand. How many people would you have to feed? Maybe 100? Maybe 200 at a really big church? This is 1,400 hungry men. What are you going to do? Well, the McDowells had hidden a bunch of cattle up in the hills, and they brought them down. And Mrs. McDowell said, take the top rail off the picket rail fence, or the split rail fence, and start fires. And they all had a steak dinner and potatoes and things of this nature on the evening of September 30th, right there where the golf course used to be, across from the McDowell house. And then they went south. Of the 7 militia leaders that I mentioned, 4 were direct Scotch-Irish descent. They had a sermon on the grounds. The Scotch-Irish Presbyterian minister Samuel Doak evoked the Battle of Gideon, Joshua, and said, you're going to do the same thing. When they got into South Carolina, or near South Carolina, they were joined by other militia groups, and they neared Kings Mountain. And on Saturday, October the 7th, 1780, these 900 patriots, they left some to follow because they weren't in as good a health, but the 900 most fit fought the battle against about 1,000 Tories that were camped on the top of that mountain with Patrick Ferguson, who said God himself will not allow me to come off that mountain. Am I right, sir? Okay. What happened? I'm not a military historian of great repute, but I would put this battle up to being one of the most decisive victories of one force over another in world history. In 1 hour, 150 years of exploitation and rage that you now understand went raging up that mountain. 244 Tories were killed, 163 wounded, and all the rest basically were captured. The Patriots suffered but 28 casualties. It ranks as one of the most complete victories. Cornwallis found out about it 2 days ago and was absolutely stunned. He said, we've got to get out of Charlottetown. They're coming for us now, and we don't have the forces because we've lost all those forces. And they retreated into South Carolina. On the way out of town, the Patriots, including my forebears, shot at them. And he said, this place is a hornet's nest of rebellion. He probably didn't know that he was naming an NBA basketball team. But if you didn't know that before, that's why we are called, the Charlotte basketball team is called the Hornets. Well, the war did not end on that day for sure. But we know that 3 months later, the Battle of Cowpens, Ferguson's forces, Tarleton's forces were raided and they fled the battlefield. We know the Battle of Guilford Courthouse was a bloody affair where patriots lost their lives, but the English forces were the Tory forces were so decimated that they basically retreated eventually into Virginia and were trapped at Yorktown. And other people can talk about the turning point of the war. And this is the famous loose picture of the painting of the battle. But on that Saturday afternoon, on that mountain, colonial America, ruled by a king across an ocean 3,000 miles away, began to crumble, die, and fade away. And in its place, a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, rose. The Scots-Irish, and I think the paradigm shift was the leaders, the king, did not become the office. The president holds the office, but does not become the office. It would be well for us to remember that this is what these people believed in. The Scotch-Irish did not single-handedly secure American independence, but I hope you now understand that without the Scotch-Irish, American independence never would have been won.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John, that was great.
Great.
We really appreciate that. I don't know if you have time for a few questions. If so, if folks may want to have a question or two, I've got a brief one.
Fire away.
Yeah. So, you're saying about how, we're used to not having the emphasis on the Southern campaign until much later in writings and history. Have you found in your research that the contribution of the Scots-Irish, the Ulster Scots, in the Revolution is a later academic study than earlier, post-war? I mean, kind of time period?
My understanding is that historians are starting to come around to the fact that this, in my view, and it's biased, biased. They were on the verge of succeeding in this Southern strategy. If they had pushed north and had gotten enough Tories to follow them, I think the war would have been lost. There were a lot of Tories in that. There were a lot of people that, they said about a third of the people in the South were for the Patriots. They wanted a new country. About a third ferociously said, I don't want this. I'm to have it pretty good with the King of England. I want to be British. And about a third were undecided or changed their minds from week to week depending on who was winning. And some were neutral, like a lot of these folks were. They just said, I don't want to get involved. I've got to raise a family until this threat came up. And you poked the wrong bear.
Whitelaw Reid, the reporter from the Northern paper who spent a lot of time at the tail end of the Civil War in the early days of Reconstruction in Asheville and its environs, was so impressed by the Scots-Irish population that he wrote a book basically saying we're the best people on earth, and perpetuated the term Scots-Irish. It's a hard book to find now, but occasionally you can find it in a used bookstore on Amazon. And so, the whole concept of the American Scots-Irish, it seems to me, has something to do with what objective observers coming in from the outside could actually see right here in Asheville. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, what happened? Whatever happened to the Scots-Irish? Well, I've got an answer for it. Who raised their hand? It's you. It's you. It's me. Assimilated into society. And what did they contribute? Well, a lot of military leaders, something like 40% of the presidents can trace their ancestry back to some Scots-Irish, some people you might not expect, some people that didn't think the way all Scots-Irish did. We had Andrew Jackson, who was clearly Scots-Irish and was a ferocious pro-slavery president. We had Ulysses S. Grant, who was a ferocious anti-slavery president. People might be taken a little aback by saying Barack Obama is part of Scotch-Irish. Why? Remember, Barack Obama's father was African. Barack Obama's mother was white we've blended into the society. What else did they bring? Well, you know, we're kind of in an urbane area, y'all are real smart and like, you know, high church and all this, but one of the things that they brought over was they brought their fiddles, and they brought their banjos, and they brought their music, and that music is turned into country music. And the great country music artists, you know, Waylon Jennings, Dolly Parton, Merle Haggard, those are all Scots-Irish people.
Right.
That music flows out of them. So,
When they couldn't find educated Presbyterian ministers, they became Baptists.
they did. That's right. And so what happened with the Presbyterians? Well, the Presbyterians had a problem in that they insisted on people going to a place like Princeton. And there just weren't that many Presbyterian ministers being produced, and when they came across the mountain, they were still religious. But the Methodists and Baptists did not have the same, that's just fact, they didn't have the same degree of requirement to preach. And so that's why you don't see a lot of Presbyterians west of the Appalachians as much, because that's why that happened. You had people, anybody Methodist? Yeah, so Asbury was well educated, really well educated minister. I greatly admire him, but he was the classic circuit rider, and he had others. He had a whole army of people. They rode across the mountains, and so they established Methodist churches. We have one in Burke County that's 200 years old and still standing, called Gilboa, that we've managed to preserve. Yes.
Gary made mention, like I said, the Southern campaigns of the American Revolution are more prominent now. We've been doing some research with one of our projects. There's an organization called the SCAR, stands for Southern Campaign of the American Revolution. That's a consortium of people that are familiar with what went on in the South that are starting to bring the Southern battles, the Southern American Revolution heroes to the forefront. Where before, everybody thought the war basically ended at Saratoga and maybe Yorktown, and this was just a void.
I have literally seen a national syndicated documentary where they said, yeah, Clinton, Cornwallis went down south and they
They came back after the
took
weekend,
these
yeah.
coastal towns and moved north and went on up into Virginia, and Washington trapped them, and that was the end of the war. See ya.
The Southern Campaign.
Really?
Saying what? Southern Campaign Group, they're out of, I think, Atlanta, Georgia.
Great.
So they're down this whole world. You're gonna see more of the American Revolution.
I mean, I think if we're gonna be honest, I mean, as SAR, I think we're duty bound to be honest. There's some ugly parts of our history, you know. I mean, Cleveland did some absolutely horrific things to the people he captured at Kingsville, that would not stand up to a military trial in this day and age. But, you know, and of course, there was all the whole idea of slavery, you know. But I think if we're gonna be honest, we gotta talk about the whole thing. And I think the southern part has been greatly overlooked up till now, and I'm hopeful that this is.
This is where the Civil War is.
As I go around and give this talk.
Exactly, yeah, spread the word.
Yeah, so.
Exactly. Well, thanks again, John. We would, thank you. We'd like to provide more evidence to your chapter that you're actually out doing outreach. So I'd like to present you with a certificate of appreciation for your talk. Thank you. And thanks again for your presentation. Very well, very informative and very much appreciated. So thank you. That's great. So if there